Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and brilliant military leader, she was also a savvy politician. Really the last ruler standing in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean world. Yet Cleopatra is often portrayed as really a tramp and a vamp, at the expense of her real admirable qualities. A number of historians wrote about Cleopatra, but ultimately the one that's most enduring and the one upon whom the film and many accounts in modern times were based is that of Plutarch. You could consider him a kind of Roman state historian. It would have been his role to explain how she was able to defeat these great Roman leaders in a way that was acceptable to the current Roman leadership. As a result, we have a history that's written by the victors. So naturally, they attempt to demonize her. She was scheming, kind of like a snake, ruthless against Rome, and able to seduce these leaders into supporting her. Plutarch tells a story of Cleopatra arriving in Caesar's headquarters rolled up in a rug. The rug is thrown out, and Cleopatra pops out right in front of Caesar's feet. It's a very dramatic story, so you can understand why virtually every treatment of Cleopatra and Caesar portrays this scene. I think that over time, the narrative of Cleopatra's life has become less accurate even than the Roman sources. In more recent portrayals, we see this sensuality emphasized and overemphasized. And this is something that resonates with, in general, Western ideas of the East. Savagery on the one hand, a kind of ruthlessness matched by this seductive quality. All of these things play upon ideas about Orientalism and are bundled up in a nice little package embodied by this narrative of Cleopatra. The painting Cleopatra Testing Poisons by Alexander Cabanel from the 19th century reflects these ideas of both sensuality and cruelty. She's sitting on a lion skin and has a live panther next to her. She's, of course, bare-breasted because she has to be sensual. Her serving woman is fanning her, gazing towards not a lover, but slaves being poisoned. It's a kind of decadence that runs as a thread through everything. So, for example, when Cleopatra receives Mark Antony, she leans back, surrounded by silks. Languorousness and sumptuousness and decadence of the court of ancient Egypt shows through. There are two kinds of visual representations of Cleopatra that actually come from her lifetime. The depictions of her on the walls of Egyptian temples would have made her look like a preeminent Egyptian queen, and especially associated her with the goddess Isis. We see a crown, for example, worn by Elizabeth Taylor, with the horns of a cow and a sun disk in between that reflect the power and authority of Isis. In reality, though, she was the descendant of a long line of Macedonian kings. She lived in a city, Alexandria, that had all the trappings of classical civilization, and people would have worn toga-like outfits, and we would have seen just a simple headband that would have tied her hair back. Her representation on coins, however, is much more likely to have been accurate and lifelike, and so this is what we really need to take as her regular appearance in life. One of the famous quotes from Shakespeare is that Cleopatra was a very honest woman, but something given to lie. Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, written in 1607, plays on many of the tropes that we see in the Roman sources, especially Plutarch, upon which he based his account. Shakespeare plays on Cleopatra's strategic thinking. Cleopatra sends her barge up into Antony's area of authority and sits and waits for him to come to her. This encounter is portrayed as a kind of whim and capriciousness by Cleopatra luring Antony in. But in fact, she wants to be seen as an equal to Mark Antony, not as his subordinate. She doesn't want Egypt to be absorbed into the Roman Empire. She wants Egypt to stand as an equal ally. The negative traits mentioned by Plutarch have carried through into the popular imagination and appear in a number of different films. Theda Bara's portrayal of Cleopatra in 1917 set the standard for all later Cleopatra portrayals. She appears in skimpy outfits, especially for the time. She adopts sensual poses, and her Egyptianness is emphasized at the expense of really her Greek cultural heritage. And this is a trope that we see repeated in all the other films. Her wiles and her sensuality simply can't be resisted.
Oh, it's you.
Her ability to defeat these Roman leaders not through her political acumen, but through her feminine wiles.
I summoned you yesterday.
The reality, however, is probably quite different. In this case, I think George Bernard Shaw probably had it right. George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra plays down the romantic qualities, the seductiveness, and really acknowledges the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra as a political one. Power and politics could not have been ignored in that context. They couldn't simply be two lovers. The stakes were too high for not only Egypt, not only Rome, but the entire Mediterranean world at that time. Shaw actually acknowledges her as a capable person in a way that we don't see in many other treatments of Cleopatra. The classic story of Cleopatra's death is that she was in her palace defeated, and rather than being paraded through Rome as a prisoner, she decides instead to commit suicide. Not by doing something simple, like drinking poison. Instead, she takes an asp and holds it to her breast, and the asp bites her, and then she dies. It's very dramatic, and plays on the trope of the snake, which has a long history in Western civilization with classical myths like Medusa. We see this portrayal of Cleopatra's death in virtually every source that deals with it, in plays, in paintings, in film. And many historians have challenged this idea of Cleopatra's death in this dramatic way as too much of a set piece. I think it has stayed on in Western consciousness from Roman times because it is so dramatic. Somehow either being assassinated or drinking poison seems like an anticlimax. Writ large on the world stage, she needs a dramatic ending. Cleopatra has entered into the Western consciousness in a way that no other ancient figure, I think, really has. It was unusual for a woman to have such prominence. Her story is one that resonates with us today in a way that perhaps 2,000 years ago wasn't possible. We can really appreciate her strong qualities. A woman who brought herself on the precipice of achieving a world empire.